She met expectations. She arrived on time. She filled the forms in blue ink. She learned the names of the people who mattered and the names of the people who did not. She understood where to sit. She understood when to laugh. She understood how to keep her hands in sight. The ledger of behavior grew neat under her hand. She learned the cadence of assent. She learned the pause that signaled concession. She practiced answers until they sounded like facts. She smiled at the precise moment. She kept the small, necessary secrets. She kept the larger, necessary absences. They called her reliable. They called her adaptable. They put her in a file labeled steady. They gave her access to things that required trust. They taught her the difference between asking and requesting. She wrote "for clarity" at the top of many emails. That phrase became shorthand. It became a small shield. It became proof of intent. When the first irregularities arrived, she cataloged them. A misdated invoice. A passcode that only worked from certain rooms. A guest on the meeting whose camera never turned on. She filed tickets. She copied managers. She printed timestamps and wrapped them in envelopes like gifts to an uncertain future. The reply was patient. "Noted. See me later," an email said. Later arrived with coffee and a steady voice. Later came with 2 chairs and an empty notepad. Later asked subtle things. "Do you sleep well? Have you been under stress? Would you discuss mindfulness?" The offers were gentle. They were curated to feel humane. They included schedules and disclaimers. She signed up for the sessions. She filled the well-being surveys with truth. She admitted to shallow sleep and a worry that had no neat name. That admission left a mark. It was a small red dot beside her name on a digital panel. It did not look like punishment. But once marked, systems rearrange around marks. Permissions narrowed. Invitations were reframed. Shared folders gathered locks she could not explain. A colleague copied her, then removed the copy. A schedule appeared with no assigned attendees. An item in procurement showed a different sender than the receipt indicated. She noticed, not as alarm, but as pattern. She took screenshots. She wrote down seconds. When she asked, they smiled with the right amount of concern. They told her it was all routine. They told her oversight had been requested. They told her compliance mattered. She continued to be compliant. Compliance had a grammar that she learned. It was written in capital letters in a dusty handbook. It had flowcharts that looped into themselves. She initialed the pages with a hand that did not tremble as much as she feared. She returned receipts and acknowledgments in neat threads. The world rewarded those moves. Her badge stayed active. Her inbox remained open. Her projects were still visible. The small machinery of reward made surrender feel like wisdom. She learned to frame questions into curiosity. She asked for clarity and meant it, and they rewarded clarity with more clarity and then with omission. Expectations once met invited more of themselves. They arrived with soft adjectives. They arrived as, "Could you?" They arrived as, "Would you mind?" The requests were not demands at first. She was asked to stay a little later. She was asked to attend a weekend review, if possible. She was asked to bring documentation from home for convenience. Each ask was small. Each ask fit into the hollow of a day. And each ask landed in her ledger as another check. She found herself answering with fewer caveats. She found herself live editing her life to accommodate the asks. She learned to pack lunches for late-night meetings. She learned to keep a spare phone charger in her coat. It felt efficient. It felt in keeping with an ethic of helpfulness. People praised her adaptability in performance reviews. Team player, they wrote. Praise is a currency. It buys you trust and then interest. Interest buys you questions about capacity. They asked whether she could take on a client who needed complete oversight. They asked whether she could handle sensitive materials that had to be stored off-site. They asked whether she could host an evening call with partners in a different time zone. She answered yes. Her yes slid smoothly into schedules and calendars. Clubs of competence begin by trading favors. She was favored. With favor came access. With access came a different set of forms. With access came a second manual, thinner and less optimistic. It smelled faintly of machine oil and denial. The questions got more precise. How many external drives do you have at home? Who else has your workstation credentials? Have you ever forwarded an email without approval? The questions were framed as routine security checks. They brought forms labeled declaration. They requested lists of devices and a log of recent off-site activity. She complied. Compliance within security makes sense. It feels patriotic to the functioning of a system. She understood this. She consented. But consent is a boundary, and boundaries can be redrawn without notice. The red dot that first marked her name spread into a fine grid of interests. Her calendar entries were cross-referenced. Her travel receipts were checked against expense reports. Someone she had met for coffee months ago was suddenly flagged as a contact of interest. There were interviews that were conversational. There were interviews that were not. Questions slid from "How are you?" to "Where do you go on the weekend?" Questions moved from "Who is on the document?" to "Who else reads the document?" She noticed the soft slide. She noticed the new verbs used around her. They began to reassign, reclassify, restrict. Language was the hinge through which change passed. When something is reclassified, it is not lost. It is relocated into a different system of meaning. She learned the meaning quickly. Her files that used to be public became internal. Meetings that used to welcome her were by invite only. She adjusted. Adjustment became a reflex. She woke to emails at odd hours that she had once forwarded without thinking and now flagged for review. She found herself summarizing not for clarity, but for containment. She learned to draft sentences that could be read by others and leave no loose ends. She learned to make narrative airtight. Her sentences shortened. Expectations expanded outward like ripples. She was asked for permissions she had not known existed. She was asked to catalog friends and previous co-workers. She was asked to turn over personal devices for inspection. Each ask had a rationale written next to it. The rationales were efficient. They spoke of risk and mitigation. They spoke of proactivity. Their sentences were short and unarguable. She complied because resistance made her movements expensive. The cost of refusal was not a rebuke, but a slow reallocation of opportunity. Projects evaporate when you refuse to attend to them. Approvals disappear from active lists. So she said yes. Yes to handing over passwords. Yes to remote access. Yes to extra training modules that arrived in her inbox at midnight. With each yes, she was entrusted with more. With each yes, the word helpful reframed into available. Available slid into on-call. On-call blurred the boundaries of home and office. Family dinners began to be punctuated by messages asking for a quick confirmation. Weekend plans included a clause, subject to urgent request. She learned to annotate her days with contingency. At first, the encroachments were strategic. They asked for small proofs of loyalty. They asked her to mentor a junior who had no prior training. They asked her to host a client dinner that had no immediate contract. She did those things. Those things became habits. Habits became expectation. Expectation became infrastructure. Then the expansion accelerated. They requested a risk statement about a project she had not yet touched. They wanted documentation of conversations that had taken place in private message threads months earlier. They asked her to map the influence of people she barely knew. They asked for names of relatives and preferred pronouns, and whether any of her acquaintances had dual citizenship. The questions were surgical. They arrived as forms with drop-down menus. They arrived as spreadsheets with cells that pulsed red until filled. She filled them because what else is there to do when a request is also a requirement? She filled it in the quiet of an evening. She felt the pages of her life flatten beneath her cursor. She felt her edges soften into fields labeled acceptable. Others watched the change with neutral faces. Their faces said nothing about the cost. They read the new forms and checked boxes and called it governance. She called it survival. There were rewards for the survival. She received invitations to closed lunches. She received bonus points and performance metrics. She was given a key to a cabinet no one else used. Privilege is a currency that can mask cost. She spent it on access. Access bought her proximity to decisions. Proximity bought her the illusion of control. That illusion is tender. It can be interrupted by a single line in an email. It can be altered by a performance review that undertakes a new metric. Metrics are excellent at remapping loyalty. They asked her to increase output. They asked her to compress timelines. They asked her to make efficiency gains without expanding the budget. Each imperative arrived with a graph. Graphs are an elegant form of persuasion. A line trending upward is a moral argument. She was asked to move the line. She moved it by reshaping her hours. She reallocated sleep. The rubric for success narrowed into things she could already do if she were attentive enough. She became more attentive. Attention is a kind of labor. Labor requires replenishment. She found replenishment harder to access. She was offered wellness credits that covered a single online class a month. She was given a stipend that paled beside the time she now spent on demand. She called friends less and left conversations half-formed. Her hobbies became notes in a planner. Reading, if time permits. The more she gave, the more was expected. The expansion was not cruel in language, it was tidy and pragmatic. A new directive arrived. Ensure continuity across silent hours. A new expectation. Maintain an emergency contact list accessible to security. Requests were now policy language. When prose becomes policy, it gains force. She complied with a curated efficiency. Compliance looked like responsibility. Responsibility was applauded in public forums. But applause is not a replacement for rest. One evening, a message asked for confirmation of her location. It was a routine check-in. She replied with a precise address. A follow-up requested a photograph of the room. The request felt intimate and standardized at once. She sent a photograph that showed only a corner. They asked for more angles. She sent the living room. They thanked her and updated records. The gratitude was procedural. It came with a note about data security. It came with a pie chart about compliance rates. The moment remained small in the register of events. But it changed the architecture of her privacy. She began to think of her home as a space that could be annotated. She labeled drawers in her head. Expectations, once expanded, travel quickly. They move along the easiest paths. They exploit the habits you have already taught them. She had taught them to be available. They used that availability as a channel. She noticed the cost in small increments. An unread book grew blank on her nightstand. A friend stopped texting about weekend plans. She missed a cousin's call because a calendar ping required immediate action. She attempted to speak about the weight of all this. She said, "I feel stretched thin." The reply came gently, "We can redirect some responsibilities." They proposed delegating tasks to a junior. Delegation is a technique of systems. It moves burden without necessarily lessening total demand. She mentored the junior. She trained them to do things the specific way that the system preferred. Training another hand into compliance is a way of multiplying the architecture. The architecture prefers multiplication. It does not so much ask as it organizes. As things multiplied, she learned new metrics. Time on task replaced presence. Response latency became a factor. She tracked minutes like currency. There were dashboards with her initials. They glowed in the mornings with targeted suggestions. They suggested micro breaks after certain thresholds. The micro breaks were reminders to rest. But rest scheduled by the system is still rest under observation. She tried to keep a private hour. She found a park bench and read a page or two. A message requested a location confirmation. She understood without thinking and sent the ping. It seemed small. The small things add up to a grammar. Sometimes expansion is not about adding new asks, but refining old ones. Be available became be reachable within 15 minutes. Be helpful became respond with proposed solutions. Nuance hardened into rule. She found herself crafting answers that were anticipatory. She learned to preempt objections. She inserted contingency plans into emails like extra stitches. Anticipation keeps the machine humming. It reduces friction. It makes you predict your own capacity. She began to predict less and to respond more. Her internal calendar filled with if-then clauses. If X happens, then I will do Y. If a partner requests a red line, I will submit by 2300. If a dataset fails validation, I will escalate immediately. Living with if-then statements is living in suspended action. It leaves less room for surprise. Surprise is both dangerous and liberating. The system prefers dangerous surprises to be contained. So she became morphine for surprise. It dulled the edges. She lost capacity to be startled into joy. Expansion also recruits identity. She updated the short biography that appears under her email. She selected descriptors that seemed to fit the role: experienced, collaborative, detail-oriented. She watched them accumulate in other people's heads. Identity becomes an asset when others can predict you. Predictability is valuable. Predictability can be monetized. She monetized herself in small ways: hours traded for praise, attention traded for access. That economy is saline to the body. It requires constant topping up. She noticed a slow hunger. Hunger is not dramatic. It is the quiet removal of reserves. It is a misbalance in sleep, a canceled call, an unbought ticket. One evening, she did something small and surprising to herself. She turned off notifications for an hour. She walked without checking pockets. She let a message go unanswered. The world did not collapse. A few items stacked up. Someone left a voicemail that was not urgent. The dashboards showed a dip in responsiveness and then a quick recovery. She learned something in that hour. She learned that absence can be a study. She learned that her absence revealed dependencies she had not seen. People adapted. Systems rerouted. The world did not punish her for a single refusal. That should have been a relief. Instead, it taught her a new lesson. Expansion is not solely enforced from above. It is reproduced from within. Her own small compliance had been one vector. She saw the mechanics of consent in a new light. She had consented to being reachable. She had consented to the cataloging of her time. She had consented to the initial red dot by telling the truth. The question then became what to do with knowledge. Knowledge invites action, if only to preserve it. She began to set small borders that were legible to others. She wrote an automatic reply, "I will reply by end of day." She scheduled blocks of time with explicit labels, focus, family, offline. She announced them publicly. Public declarations help make boundaries enforceable. A manager complimented the clarity of her new scheduling. That compliment was a small victory. Yet expansion continued. Systems expand to fit the tolerances of the people inside them. If you push back, they refine. If you accept, they grow. She pushed back sometimes. She accepted often. There were quiet consequences. Some projects were reassigned to those who remained perpetually available. Others were given to teams that could promise midnight turnarounds. She watched opportunity slide along the elasticity of time. One morning, she received an email that the performance rubric had been updated. It included a new metric, Flexibility Index. The index measured responsiveness outside standard hours. It was given a weight in compensation. She read the document and felt the air thin. The index was neutral in tone. Its equations were cold. It turned the moral act of being helpful into a measurable variable. Measurement instructs behavior. She saw the contours of her choices sharpen. She decided to change the terms of engagement in ways that mattered. She refused a late-night ask that had no clear priority. She proposed a reallocation of resources instead. That refusal was readable. It was not defiant. It was strategic. It asked others to account for their own time. The reply thanked her and promised to reconsider processes. Promises, like other instruments, are elastic. They stretch to accommodate what is convenient. Her refusal made a small dent. A junior took on the midnight task and discovered it was unsustainable. That discovery generated a conversation about workflow redesign. Conversations are a peculiar kind of progress. They allow you to reframe obligations without eliminating them. The redesign recommended rotating on-call responsibilities and creating a fund for overtime. The fund was a patch. Rotations redistributed burden. She signed on to the new plan with cautious relief. Relief is rarely absolute. It arrives as a temporary reprieve. Systems adapt, and the adapted system demands new adaptations. She learned that the horizon of expectation is never fixed. It is a moving line that follows the path of what you allow. If you allow that line to be redrawn without your presence, it will be redrawn to suit the easiest hand. She chose to be a hand that set edges. She did not do it all at once. She started with sentences. "I will reply by end of business day" became, "I will reply within 24 hours." Available for emergencies became, "Available for documented emergencies only." Small reframings change rhythm. Rhythm is a substrate for expectation. Change the rhythm and the expectations follow. Some people resist change, others adapt quickly. In response, the machine offered other incentives. It offered visibility in company communications. It offered access to prime accounts. It offered a badge that glinted in the intranet. The offers were tempting. But offers always cost something. She considered what she would trade for visibility. She considered how much private time she could afford to exchange for a public line. She measured, She weighed the tokens. She decided where to concede and where to hold. Holding felt radical in a culture of give. When she held, others noticed. Some admired her discipline. Some found the change inconvenient. A former ally asked for favors and received a gentle no. She lost small things by holding. She also gained a slow reconstitution of time. That reconstitution allowed for afternoons that were not interrupted by a pulse of urgency. She began to read longer passages. She met expectations, and then she did something bolder. She proposed a line in the policy: work hours are between X and Y, unless previously agreed. The line was reviewed and redrafted and eventually accepted with qualifiers. Policy changes are slow. They are also durable. A small durable change can alter the way expansion occurs. The system learned new constraints. It adjusted its expectations. Expansion did not stop. It shifted. It found other channels. It asked for metrics that could be measured within working hours. That was progress. Progress is a halting thing. Sometimes progress is a pause between expansions. Sometimes it is a reallocation. She recognized finally that expectation is not an enemy. It is a partner that can be taught new steps. If you teach it the dance of your boundaries, it learns to move differently. She had been taught the language of containment. She had been taught how to answer. She had used that language to comply. Then she used the same language to reframe. The tools that hold you can also hold others. She taught juniors to ask for scheduled overtime. She taught managers to write clearer priorities. She taught the system to imagine capacity as a resource that requires replenishment. There were losses. There were shifts in alliances. There were dinners she missed and dinners she kept. There were late nights that remained. She learned to be economical with her time and generous with her attention. She learned to say yes where it mattered and no where it did not. She learned that expectation expands into the space you leave open. She learned to make that space intentional. She learned that compliance can be a map rather than a prison. She learned to draw lines where she wanted them and to label them clearly. She learned to keep the forms and to change the boxes. And in the quiet moments, when a break in the day stretched like a small blue thread, she read. She read about other people who had been good at complying and then discovered the cost. She read about small rebellions that had been written into policy. She slept better some nights. Expectations continued to expand, as they always would. But she had learned the language. She could mark where the expansion would be allowed and where it would not. She could sign forms and forestall other signatures. In that way, meeting expectations had become the first move. The next moves were hers. I learned to measure silence the way others measure distance. Not in meters. Not in steps. But in pauses between replies. A message unanswered for 10 minutes meant nothing. An hour suggested review. A full day meant the message had been discussed somewhere I could not see. Expectation does not arrive loudly. It expands the way fog expands. Quietly. Evenly. Until the landmarks you trusted are no longer visible. At first, meeting expectations felt like safety. There were clear tasks. Clear approvals. Clear endings to the day. Completion is comforting. You submit. They confirm. The system records that nothing is wrong. But systems grow hungry for smoothness. When nothing is wrong, they begin searching for improvement. Could you also? While you're there. It would help if. Each sentence polite. Each request reasonable. Each addition small enough to feel harmless. Expansion rarely looks like pressure. It looks like trust. They trusted me with access. Then, with oversight. then with anticipating needs before they were written. Anticipation is where the boundary dissolves. Because once you are expected to predict, anything you fail to predict becomes your responsibility. I began checking messages before they arrived, drafting replies to questions not yet asked, correcting documents no one had opened. Efficiency is praised. Speed is rewarded. Prevention is invisible, until it stops working. Moo, then the question appears. Why didn't you catch this? Not angry. Not loud. Just curious in a careful, documented way. Curiosity when written down becomes evidence. I reviewed timelines. I traced edits. I reconstructed decisions from fragments of meeting notes and half-sentences. Nothing was broken, but something had shifted. The work was no longer the task. The work was maintaining the appearance that the task had always been enough. Expectation expanded again. It moved into tone, into timing, into how quickly concern appeared on my face when problems were mentioned. Performance without a stage. Observation without an observer. I smiled more carefully, paused before speaking, nodded in rhythms that suggested agreement without promising anything measurable. Agreement is safest when it cannot be audited. Still, the boundary kept moving. Availability became devotion. Devotion became proof. Proof became the minimum required to remain where I already was. I stayed later, answered faster, reduced the size of my own life until it fit neatly around the margins of the work. No one asked me to do that, which made it harder to explain why I had. Because expansion, once internalized, feels voluntary.
So, one evening I noticed the building was silent in a different way. Not empty. Just finished with me for the day. The lights above my desk turned off automatically. The screen dimmed. The system logged an inactivity warning I had never seen before. I moved the mouse. The warning disappeared. But the feeling remained. That the work could continue without my permission. Meeting expectations had once meant belonging. Now it meant staying ahead of a line that kept advancing. And I began to understand something quiet and precise. Expectations do not expand because you fail. They expand because you succeed. Success proves capacity. Capacity invites demand. Demand, once normalized, rewrites the past until it looks inevitable. Soon it would seem as if this had always been required, as if I had always agreed, as if the smaller version of the work had never existed at all. I sat in the dim light, listening to the quiet machinery of continuation, and for the first time, meeting expectations did not feel like safety. It felt like the beginning of something that did not know how to stop.